Everybody, and welcome to Forever Sports. And a very interesting story emerging this week, which has some pretty big ramifications and kind of starts to show why going the European route is beneficial for the South African teams. And maybe the first real example of exactly why we made the switch and why it's going to be such an important one moving forward. Because the big thing was about money. Now, Bulls have rejected a multi-million rand potential deal to sell one of their players to try and lock them down for more years, and which will mean, you know, giving him a bigger contract, as well as having the ability to turn down the money, saying they don't need it, which is a huge shift from where South African teams have been in the past, where they've not been able to deal with the kind of money that overseas teams bring in to the table, basically, to first of all, to offer the player as well as to offer the union itself. And so maybe this is the first opportunity we are seeing a bit of a shift where the South African teams are not going to just be bullied by bigger money and just, letting their players go whenever and whenever, it basically happens. So before we get into it, please just smash like on the video. Please do subscribe to the channel as well. The big one is it's Kurt Arendse. So basically, the Bulls allowed Kurt Arendse to go on a sabbatical to Japan. We see this quite often. Not even just in South Africa, actually, but we've seen Maxwell Mapimpi go to Japan. We've seen Kanya take a sabbatical in Japan as well. The All Blacks also have sabbaticals. That's why Geordie Barrett's playing in for Leinster. We've got Rico Ioane, who's going to Leinster next season as well. So sabbaticals have become quite common in terms of an opportunity to go and earn some really good money for a short stint whilst not basically losing the player entirely. So it allows players to go and earn a bit of money, but it also allows unions to keep these players sort of long term. And as soon as sort of Kurt Arendse touched down in Japan, he started playing really, really well, as we kind of expected. And all of a sudden, there was talks about the fact that he had been offered a permanent contract and that his stay in Japan would become permanent and he would not make the return to the Bulls. And there's a lot of speculation, basically, that the Bulls would then basically be releasing him. Now, in the last couple of days, it has been confirmed that the Bulls are saying that he will not be leaving and that, there was never any intention of him leaving and they're not going to basically allow him to leave, saying that he's not for sale, and basically this is the big sort of mark, is that the Bulls can afford to say no to the money. First of all, they're getting a big payout because of the Cardi Sari situation where he signed for the Bulls and then kind of got bought out of the contract without him actually playing for the Bulls. But the big thing, I think, is the fact that first of all, they're obviously going to offer Kurt Arendse a really good contract, which will sort of up, obviously, his current salary and make it a bit more in line as to what he could have earned in Japan. But also, the fact that to a certain degree, they're going to talk about him having to honor his contract. And we're not going to just have players being bought out because we can't financially cope with it and because we're so desperate for the money that when the money hits the table, we basically have to say yes. So it's a whole different dynamic we've suddenly got where we've got more financial power within our unions to be able to keep our players in South Africa. And this is a huge shift. 2-3 years ago, he would have gone. It would have been quite simple. He would have gone over, liked it, been given a contract, he would have stayed over there. We've seen it happen far too many times. But now, in and amongst players who are coming back to South Africa, your Eben Etzebeth, Sieg Lees, Kobus Rana for next season, Andre Pollard for the Bulls, all these players coming back, we are also tying down our current stars and keeping our talent in South Africa. So it's a really, really good thing for South African rugby. We talk about the fact that we're having a pretty poor season, if we're being honest, across the URC, Champions Cup, Challenge Cup for South African teams. URC will obviously all depend on exactly what happens towards the end. But, the Storm was very lucky to be in the top 8 at the moment. The Sharks got lucky this last weekend to get a result. Didn't play particularly well despite being pretty stacked. The Bulls are currently in a very good URC space, but had an awful EPCR campaign. And we talked about the fact it comes down to squad depth. Now, keeping a Kurt Arendse whilst having a Kane Moody, a Villaroo, a Andre Pollard, that is where you start to build the type of depth you need to contend in these competitions. And this is kind of the problem. You look at the Lions and they had a really good start to the season. Then all of a sudden had a couple of injuries. You start to see the squad depth not quite being there. And then players leave us. And then the Humber's leaving and Marius Lowe's leaving. We've got, key players leaving consistently all the time from the Lions. And they just can't keep up with the amount of exits. So it becomes a consistent sort of case of having to try and replace players rather than building squad depth. And now we are seeing a shift where a Kurt Arendse is going to come back and he's going to stay with the Bulls, and they're still bringing in other big players. So, you could see a backline next year, which could look something like Ambrose Pierre at 9, Andre Pollard at 10. You could have Kane Moody, Kurt Arendse as your wings, Willie Leroux at full back, Johan Goosen probably coming off the bench, You know, you're going to have David Creel at inside center, Esteban Khansa outside center. You know, you're going to have a really strong Bulls side. But again, you can have Jan Goosen coming off the bench, for example, or you can have Willie Leroux coming off the bench, Devin Williams coming off the bench. And that's a completely different dynamic to always it being a case of, well, if Jan Goosen's injured, all of a sudden you have to have Keegan Johannes, who's a bit of a makeshift number 10 coming in. You know, Buddha Chamberlain, who struggled, and the likes of it. Now you've got the Bulls fly half, he's been the number one choice for the past few years, basically now going to be playing it for bench role. And that's the kind of depth we need to be able to contend in these different competitions. So I don't think you can actually overstate the significance of this Kirkley Arendse deal not happening, because we're all of a sudden seeing our teams being able to fight against international money to keep our players in the country. Now, a lot of people are saying that that they should be allowing him to go over there, that he should really get that pay package and the likes of that. At the end of the day, it is the player's decision. You know, if Bulls, for example, don't release him for his contract, he has to then obviously see it out, but he doesn't have to extend. So if we see him extend for the Bulls, then obviously it's a situation where the Bulls have gone to the table, they've offered him a decent amount of money that's worth him staying here, and he's then renewed. And even that in itself is very significant in us being able to afford contracts that make it financially sound for these players to be playing in South Africa. So it might sound like an arbitrary, the Bulls are just, holding on to a player against his will, whatever, but it's far more complex than that, and I think it's far more significant than that as well, because traditionally we've not been able to do that in the last few years, be able to negotiate to keep players, in the same as David Willemse, being linked to Leinster, and the Storm is saying, no, he's not going anywhere, we're going to stay him and keep him here. These are very significant steps we're taking as a union, or as a federation, I suppose, to be able to make sure that our best players are playing down here. Yeah, obviously there will still have to be players overseas. We can't bring the entire Springbok squad back to South Africa and afford to be able to pay them what they're all earning overseas. Like a Colby, for example, who's earning absolute bank of the likes of him. But we can all of a sudden start to slowly keep more of our talent within the South African talent pool and bring players back in to really strengthen our union so that they can be a lot more competitive across different competitions. And hopefully it is going to be a matter of time before we go and win a Champions Cup. That's the only one that's actually left, to be honest. We've already won a URC, we've won a Challenge Cup, so we've made significant steps, but we just don't feel like we're consistently contending. And that's not to say we need all four of our unions to be at the top level, but you need like a Bulls, for example, to be consistently making top or quarterfinals, semifinals of Champions Cup. The Bulls and the Sharks, for example, they're the current strong teams. They need to be contending for Champions Cup and looking to win the URC. One tier down from that, you want the Stormers making URC playoffs and maybe contending for the Challenge Cup in a final. And the Lions, for example, if they're sort of finishing 8th or 9th every season, that's not terrible, to be honest. If you've got 4 out of your 8 teams finishing in the top 10 in the URC, that's not dreadful. It's frustrating as a Lions fan because I would like to see us in the playoffs, but you need to check across the board where our South African teams are performing. And we're almost there, but not quite. There's far too much inconsistency, which often comes with lack of squad depth and being able to rotate and being able to use full squads, which I think a lot of the coaches are still learning how to do because they haven't traditionally had the kind of squads they've had to manage. And there's just a massive drop of talent between, the Sharks' best 15 and their second best 15 and the likes of that. So let me know what you think about this deal down in the comments below. Smash a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Steve. I'll chat to you soon.